Hello and welcome everybody to another puzzle challenge video with ChessUniversity.com. This is Ryan Murphy presenting the puzzle, and we're going to start like we usually do with the solution to yesterday's puzzle before moving on to what is going to be our hardest puzzle of the week since it is the end of the week. So we're starting here is white to play and try to make a draw, or at least equalize in all variations, as without the best move in this position, white's in considerable trouble. They're down material, the rooks are misplaced. White's kind of all in on the king side here. So if you haven't solved it, take a moment to pause now, because I'm going to proceed with the solution in just a moment. Okay, so I will start by saying that in the game this comes from, queen g6 was played with the intention of playing the move rook takes h6. The problem with this move is it's too slow. It doesn't create any very large, like there's no big check. Well, there's the check, I guess, on e6 to consider. But besides this threat, which can be parried, there's no substantial immediate threat. And this threat to the e6 pawn can easily be countered with queen b6, which not only defends, but makes a very severe counterattack, threatening a checkmate with queen takes f2, queen f1. And this turns out to be very difficult for white to beat, and white is in fact lost. So queen g6 is not the way to go. However, rook takes h6 is the way to go, because this allows white to play this check on the next move if the rook isn't taken. And this check will lead to more checks. And also there's no easy way to stop the queen from coming to h7 except by taking the rook. So we'll first see what happens if black accepts the sacrifice. That's the most critical variation. And white at least is going to have a repetition of moves by giving check to the king. And white's going to continue checking along the diagonal. And eventually, if black tries to do something else, if they try to avoid the repetition of moves and put the king on a different square, we can see what will happen. So for example, if they try to go to e8 now, which is really one of two other ways they can try to escape, you can take on e6 with check, and now really the only way to avoid just repeating back into that loop, like if they go to f8 you can just continue checking, is to block with the queen on e7. And now you can actually swap, take on d5 with check, take the rook on f4, and you're going to have a lot of pawns as white for that knight. And yeah, I don't know if the computer fully understands this position, but I would say if anyone's better it should be white. I mean, white has very healthy pawns against the knight. So this is pretty dangerous, I think, for black to allow. Another move which should not be played by black is king to e7. This allows the simple queen takes g5 check, forking and winning the rook and the game. And really, yeah, besides that, all else they can do is go back, and going in the corner doesn't help because I can just keep checking. So there's really no easy way out of this for black. So best case is a draw. And the other move, which I mentioned previously, instead of taking the sacrifice, they can play queen b6 and try to counterattack, try to threaten a checkmate. Here, white's going to do something very similar. They're going to give a check. And now they're simply just going to defend against this threat. You can do that in a couple of ways. One way is to block the queen with rook e3. The other, which I think is possibly more natural, is knight to d1. It guards two things. It guards both the mate and the b2 pawn. And this rook is still left in a very active position on g3, threatening the pawn. It's more flexible this way. But yeah, rook e3 is fine too. G takes h6 should now be played, because what else is black going to do? Sorry. They're just getting attacked for nothing if they don't take the rook. And now the floodgate is opened and all the checks will commence. And here, if they try to run, right, they can also try to run towards the queen side. But as we saw in the previous variation, there's always this check picking off the rook. So if they try to run to d8 or to e7, there's going to be queen g5. So the only other thing they can really do besides repeating is to block with the rook. And if they block with the rook, you've got rook f3, and you're going to pick up material like this. And we reach a very complicated position where white's definitely not worse, and can easily be better if black doesn't play this well. In fact, white is a pawn up, so black's the one that's going to have to prove something here. That is in fact the best line for white, or those starting with rook takes h6 rather. Everything after that gets quite messy, but white's okay in all the lines. Alright, so that's the solution to yesterday's puzzle, rook takes h6 with this queen h7 and queen g6 check idea. And now we can move on to the fresh puzzle of the day, which is this one. And here it's white to play and win. There's only one move which is forced win. It's very complicated. So I'll leave this one for you guys to solve. The link for the official post is in the description if you'd like to make your comment on ChessUniversity.com. If you do so, you can get reward points credited to your account. So check that out if it sounds interesting to you. Otherwise, I'm going to take us back to the start of this game, which was a very messy game with lots of cool tactical themes. So this was a modern Benoni, characterized by this pawn structure of d6, c5 against the d5 pawn. And now e4, g6, f4. This is a 4 pawns attack line. You can actually get this from both the King's Indian defense and the Benoni. Bishop b5 check is probably the sharpest and most dangerous line here. Kasparov used to play this. Knight f to d7 is the main line. There are some side lines that are pretty risky for black with knight b7 or bishop d7, but both of those other ways of blocking allow the move e5, which is generally considered to be very good for white. So knight f d7 covers the e5 square with the bishop and the knight and the pawn. So there's no e5 business here. So a4 played. And now queen h4 check, which is a line, is played. And the queen comes back to e7, putting pressure against e4. Knight ge2 is not the best move. The knight's supposed to go to f3 in these lines because it protects both the d4 square and the e5 square. It makes it easier in the long run to play for e5. Knight ge2 does get a piece out, but it's just sort of not on a good square. Also, the other downside is if white's going to put the rook on the e-file, it's not going to immediately protect the e4 pawn. It's going to be blocked by the knight. So black should actually be relatively doing quite well here, at least at this point. But then this knight comes over on the queen side, heading to b4, which is probably slightly misplaced. If instead black had played knight f6, attacking e4 directly, this would have been somewhat annoying for white to deal with. For example, there was a game which went queen c2, then bishop h3, rook d1, a6, bishop d3, and knight b7, and black was doing really well because they had the e5 break under cover. It was very hard to play that move from the white side, and the e4 pawn was under a lot of pressure. So, and black, I think, eventually did win this game from 2010. Okay, but knight a6 was played, which is also possible. This knight can sometimes come to c7 and then help later support the move b5, and in some cases it can go to b4. But it doesn't immediately challenge white's setup. So white took on d7. Kind of controversial to give the bishop pair, but their point is that they want to play very directly on the king side, which is what they did. And they played f5 here. Now this is risky in that it's giving up the e5 square forever. So this is an outpost for black permanently. But the point I think that white made with bishop takes on d7 is that it's not that easy for black to establish a knight on this square because the knight on d7 is gone, got traded off, and this knight on a6 is a long way from reaching e5. So white's hoping to stir up a lot of controversy on the king side before black can do anything dangerous like attacking e4 or infiltrating along the dark squares. So very interesting approach by white, very aggressive. Knight b4 here was played. It looks good at first, but it's kind of just an artificial piece. Probably what was better here was to immediately, again, try to put pressure through the center, and then if white's to continue on the king side with g4 and pushing the pawns, then there should be ways to get counterplay here. At minimum against the king, moves like bishop here, and then the queen coming to h4 look interesting. Also, there's this concept of c4 and then knight c5 to put additional pressure against the center, which I quite like. This seems to challenge the knight ge2 development plan. So knight b4 was played though. g4 by white. White's being consistent here, attacking on the king side. Queen h4 is a very important move, I think. Taking advantage of white's last move, because previously the pawn protected this square. And now there's ideas of bishop b5 coming, and trying to at least bother white around their king. So I think that's a very reasonable move. Knight g3, bishop d4 check, king g2. And here, unfortunately for black, they retreated the queen all the way back to e7, which was a bit strange. I think continuing to be aggressive with bishop e5 was probably the better way to go. White can, of course, exchange this bishop with bishop f4, but that's double-edged because their own king would be very weak too. But yeah, I think keeping the queen on h4 would have not allowed the attacking mechanism that white got in the game, which starts with bishop h6, attacking the rook, and now g5. And white simply wants to shove the pawns up the board, swing the rook to the h-file, put the, eventually remove this bishop, take on on g6, and then bring the queen in and try to mate. So it's a very long-term attacking idea, but it's also very annoying and not that easy to deal with. Here, bishop e3 was played. h4, like I said, just kind of going for it. c4, queen e2, attacking the bishop. Bishop goes back. And now h5. And this is a very scary moment for black. And here black plays the move knight d3. I don't really know if there was anything they could have done that was better. Funny thing about this position is if you give it to an engine, it'll actually suggest knight d3, and it'll say white is doing slightly better at first, on a low depth, of course. But this is not a really good position for low depth. You really need to dig deep to figure out what's going on here. White's threats are very dangerous, but they're further down the line. So knight d3 was in fact played, and now it is white to play and win. So, as I said, take a lot of time here. It's quite a tricky, I don't want to call it a combination. It's more of a concept that white has, but it's very direct. Like it's a variation with a sequence of moves. Black has to find only moves, and even if they find the only moves, they're essentially getting mated or losing a lot of material. So hopefully you guys like this one. It's really challenging. Good way to end the week. We'll start with our easy puzzles again tomorrow, and hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see everyone for the next puzzle challenge video. Thank you for watching.